2,000 subscribers, guys. We did it. It's a milestone. 4 months it took us to get here, and again, we did it. So thanks to all of those who actively commented, who liked and subscribed, all my supporters on Coffee, my members, all of that. I really do appreciate that. Anyway, today's gonna be a big Q&A. So let's start with the questions. So Sofia Duran asks, and I've seen you in the other Q&A. I know, you're shocked. I have good memory. How can I convince an SX486 EFVL ESI that he's not an ENTJ LIE? I would just say look at the SI, tell him about the SI vulnerable, and tell him about the logical versus a feeling dichotomy. The LIE as a type, it excels in the objective world of information or efficiency, pragmatism, method, optimization of the environment, right? So everything is about pragmatism. With their low FI, they actually struggle with relations, with kind of psychological distance, with knowing how to handle those relations with people. They need advice, they need help. That's the biggest thing. They can often be lost in the pragmatism and chasing whatever job they need to execute and neglect all the other parts, their sentiments, and neglect also their feelings and their relationships, destroy those relationships along the way. Also tell him the NLIE has SI vulnerable. That means this guy, listen, from my experience, I know some LIEs, and they can be completely oblivious to their internal state, their harmony, dealing with mundane details or mundane activities, or at least the activities they deem mundane. Like I've seen some of them living in caves, not literally, but living in a fucking dumpster, not sleeping for 3-4 days. It's like, you have this idea of a CEO businessman, but in fact you have a fucking guy who barely changes his pants and doesn't sleep because he has insomnia, so tell him about that. An LIE just is oblivious to his own internal state and obviously doesn't take care of himself and doesn't take care of the many details that he deems as mundane. ESI, on the other hand, can be much more try-hard with the SI, taking care of their bodies, being more organized in their environment, even taking care of other people's internal states, something that can happen. Again, the mommy dom that can feed you a cake, that's something an ESI can do. Natsur asks, what's your opinion on Big Five? My opinion on Big Five is really, it's considered the most accurate way of measuring your personality characteristics in psychology. So I don't really have an opinion, it's just the best. Objectively. So that's what I think about Big Five. It's objectively the best, because it doesn't slap any labels on you, some cool things. It just measures bunch of different traits, and that's it. Lina Sauce asks, what are the differences between SP3 and SP7? To keep it simple, think of it like this. SP3 is more of the responsible individual who's much more conscientious, much more hardworking, providing for those that he loves, more perfectionistic. And also, there's an aspect where they believe what they do defines their self-worth. That means when they have a job, maybe they do something, right? They want to perform very good. They need to know that what they do is actually on par, and they measure themselves by their success of what they do, being the best in what they do, excelling in it. So it's about the performance, and they measure how well they do. That is what it is. It's nothing else to them that matters. With SP7, I think you have more of you don't really have the high conscientiousness, that responsibility. You don't have those traits. In fact, many SP7s they can lack conscientiousness, they can be flaky, they can be irresponsible, they can be bullshitters and charlatans. So for them, it's not really about being responsible as much as it is chasing that mental stimulation. So Upper Will asks, how can LIE and SP7 be compatible? I mean, LIE is SI vulnerable. Stereotypically, can't chill, and SP7 is too much about physical pleasure. Well, you're thinking of very much the classical ILE SP7 FLEV degenerate cunt who just wants to really be a hedonist, right? Tyrion Lannister, right? I guess someone like that. But even then, it's not really about the physical pleasure, right? I used to always think, okay, it's SP7 is a hedonistic type, it's about physical, but it's not. It really isn't, because it's actually about escapism. It's about escaping the reality by indulging in different things and getting that kind of satisfaction. But it's primarily mental. It's a mental type. So an SP7 is going to be a very mental type. You do need to have a lot of NE. So there is an aspect of that indulging in the present and indulging into things that are more sensorical, but that's not really the main core of the type at all. Even though it might seem like that, maybe from an outsider's perspective, you see someone being in the degenerate, maybe Charlie Sheen, doing drugs, and you think, okay, he must be a sensing type. Then you look really into it, how he even thinks and what he does, why he does what he does. You see that there's actually a mental motivation and a mental component to it. That's the biggest difference. Don't put SI as pleasure seeking. It isn't really so. Because look, one of the biggest hedonistic types ever is SCE SX2. They're one of the most hedonistic types ever, right? FEVL. Very hedonistic. And they're SE base. So you don't need to be SI to have the physical pleasure. Besides, SP7 is not about that. SP7 is not about physical pleasure. Kostolom asks how to discern SP8 from SX6 from external view. Many differences. To keep it simple, SP8 is only SLE in socionics and only EST in Jung. SX6 is LSI and introverted thinking in introverted ITS in Jung, right? So there's a big difference. Externally, you see SP8 is much more animalistic. It's much more action-oriented rather than thinking. They're not as, again, they're just more so externally focused, grasping at the tangible and getting the satisfaction they want, without thinking twice about it. So there is that component. While SX6 is much more cautious, much more logical, much more introverted, more withdrawn, more methodical, more planning. They are more likely to look at someone like an SP8 and think, whoa, you're acting dumb, you're acting like a monkey. That's the perception of an SX6 might have on SP8, because they think they're acting maybe irrational or impulsively or not really thinking things through. That's something that can happen between those two types. And in general, just look at SP at the end of the day is extroverted sensation. So that's all you need to know. That's the biggest difference. And if you've ever seen Watchmen, there is a character called the comedian, and also Rorschach. So the comedian is probably SP8 and Rorschach is SX6. Now look at those and think, are they really that similar? They really aren't, right? Meziloi, you guys need to have easier names. Key differences between EIE and LIE, and rational and irrational. So key differences. Oh yeah. Listen, man, it's the same thing. It's the same thing as logical and feeling dichotomy. Use that dichotomy; it'll help you. EIE is much more personal and much more focused on inspiring people on an emotional level, changing people's moods, affecting people's emotionally. They're much more emotionally manipulative and they're much more attention whoring. That's the reality. LIEs are not that way. They're much more logical people who, even when they're climbing the social ladder like an EIE would in some ways, it's different because it's not done in interpersonal fashion. It's not about affecting and changing people's moods or like some savior complex individual. No, it's about having that tangible worth that can showcase that they're, again, worth something. Achievements, labels, status, whatever it is. But it's tangible. It's not interpersonal. And then rational and irrational is simply put, rationals are usually more rigid, strict, authoritarian in their leadership. They finish projects, right? When they start something, they're able to consistently push through. Again, much more consistent, much more rigid, and not changing their minds, much more inflexible and intolerant. On the other hand, irrational types are much more adaptable. They're much more... They can wait and see. They can wait for things and see how they play out. They can change their decisions frequently. They can start many projects, but not finish many of them, or maybe not finish any of them at all. Felipe Carvalho, which is probably Italian. He looks Italian. So Felipe Carvalho. That's usually how they talk. So, well, it's just a question that I have. How does physics and psychosophy relate? Listen, it's a good question. I'll tell you this. The way they appear to the external world can be something that they put effort in and can be kind of way of expressing how they feel on the inside. That's something that an EIE can do. And that's still going to be part of physics. A combination, obviously, of emotion and physics. But you get my point. Sidozo asks, what do you think about vultology? I think there's some basis to it. For example, maybe an SE base talking a certain way. and any base talk in a certain way, I think you can draw patterns, obviously, right? In the way they communicate their ideas, how they move, right? Gesticulate, all of that. You can see those big differences between types. So I think there is merit to it within reason. Once you start talking to me that, your one eyebrow was higher than the other, that's why the left signal of your nutsack was a bit too shifty, so that means you use NE. That's where you're tripping, you're taking drugs. Do you think analyzing somebody who's drunk is the best way to type them? Because they are more acting like themselves. Now, I will tell you no, because they're not being themselves. Think about it this way. You think because they have no inhibition, they tell you what they think. And while yes, that might be the case, in typing that's not useful, because you walk in a bar, there's an IEI. This IEI drinks a lot, right? He's usually very shy, inhibited, insecure, whatever. Then he drinks, he becomes bombastic, very all over the place, and then you see, whoa, he's acting like an FE base. He's very emotionally expressive, wow, super no inhibition, and little do you know, then he's slurping someone off at the counter. That's, you know what I'm saying? That's because of not having any inhibition. Alcohol it altered the personality of this individual. It's a substance that alters your behavior and your inhibitions. It's not ideal, because you're not typing this individual based on how he's like without inhibitions. You want to see a person, how they are with all their inhibitions, because that's how they really are when it comes to the type. Okay? And IEI can seem very bombastic, and EIE. Same IEI, that's sober, will seem extremely IEI. So it's not really useful. Type them when they're not drunk. Tokemon asks, do you think all 1Vs are shameless and ruthless with people? And can they be lazy? All 1Vs are not shameless, because first, if we use the true definition, like shameless, no human is completely shameless, unless they're psychopathic. But other than that, no. Now, the closest thing to being shameless in PY, in my opinion, would be the combination of 1V and 4E. That would be the closest to shamelessness, because it's unfiltered expression of self with no regard, right? No insecurity in it. So it kind of makes sense. 1V4F, 1V3E, many of those types are not shameless, right? And they're still human. And are they all ruthless with people? I mean, they're just normal people. At the end of the day, they're normal people. The difference here is that they value their own decisions, their own autonomy, and their own will. And their own will is more important than your will or anyone else's will. That's that's just it. So, usually they're just seen as selfish people in their desires and wants. Can they be lazy? You're looking at an example. I type 1v4 subtype, right? Result subtype in first will. So, indifference to self-actualization and goal setting. Anyone who's typed me knows this about me. Growing up, always been told, you're very smart, you're very intelligent, but you're very lazy. Because I was lazy in a sense because I did not have any interest in those things that people wanted to push on me. Those responsibilities people had for me, those expectations. And I didn't really pay attention to them. I didn't really care about them. So instead I would do other stuff that maybe many people would consider a waste of time. And I would rather do that because it's more fun to me and I prefer it. So that's how it would be like, based on that, you can be lazy because you're not constantly, you don't have that drive that's focused on self-actualization and ambition. You're just indifferent. You want to get your goodies and you want to bounce. A 3V person can be more successful because they're processing will constantly and they're always driven by the need to prove themselves or prove wrong to other people. So there's this drive because they need to be chasing towards something. Once they relax, they will feel restless. They'll feel bad. And for 1V, it's often like they don't really feel the need to process will or anything. It just doesn't happen. So it depends again, I think there's variety. Some 1Vs are extremely ambitious and some 1Vs might not give a fuck. It does happen like that. So it depends on the individual. Now, and he also asks, what are some major opinions you've changed your mind on in typology? Many. Talking about many, I've changed my mind many times throughout history of typology. I've started believing in, we all started, right? Believing in Riso Hudson, ENTP8, ENTJ8, ESTP7. We've all started there. So much changed. But the biggest ones, SX4. I used to defend EIE SX4, right? I theory drooled, and I was drooling over theory, and I was going against the ESI wave. But the more I looked at the real life application of typology, the more I realized, wow, I cannot. If I was to sit here and say EIE SX4 works so well, I would be denying objective reality. I'm not the type to do that. So after observing that, looking at actual examples of how it manifests, I noticed a pattern. I noticed a pattern that every time people were using examples of those EIE SX4s, they were not talking about EIE SX4s. Those were not SX4s. Kanye West, John Lennon, Adolf Hitler. They were using examples that were not SX4 EIE. So I'm like, okay, this is very telling. They have a very skewed perception of what the type is because they're not typing the proper individuals. And that's when I knew, okay, it's time to bounce. I cannot deny reality. I'm gonna adapt. And that's one of those things. And another thing was SP7. I used to say it's possible. I used to say, okay, I was on the fence. I want to know if it's true or if it's not true. After a while, I was reading more into it. I actually gave a fuck and I tried to learn more. I found out, yes, it's true that what I thought was an SP7 was not an SP7, right? An SP7 is a mental type with a lot of abstraction behind it. And it does need a lot of intuition. So that completely changed my mind. And I had no problem adapting to it. Daintre asks, I heard from 4 of my co-mates that your jungian typing must correlate with socionics typing and MBTI typing. What's your take on that? Listen, I don't really care too much about like sitting there and like correlations between Jung and MBTI. The less mental gymnastics you have to pull, the better it is. Cheese asks, main things to look for when distinguishing 8 core subtypes. 8 is circle jerked in the community for sure. And we have a lot of information seemingly, yet mistypes happen all the time. People don't understand the subtypes. I see SX8s, many SP8s being typed as SX8s, many SO8s being typed as something else, vice versa. So our understanding of subtypes is fucked up. My understanding of subtypes was always fucked up, which is why it was impossible for me to type my subtype. Lately, I've been researching more, reading more from Naranjo, really trying to see the differences, really looking at the real life examples. And there are some ways to tell the difference. With SO8, even from my personal experience and from what I've seen, they do come across as more mellow, more friendly and reasonable individual. That is true. I've always fought against it, but that's the reality. They are goody two-shoes. There's no way around it. And in real life, that's how they come across. Friendly, amicable individuals who value their bonds and connections with people and value complicity, creating those relations and being almost in a position of authority and as a protector, provider. That's that gives them this, they make other people depend on them. But generally speaking, they are more social, antisocial, more compassionate, more likely to protect others, protect those. There's a focus on creating those relations and have almost give and take relationship between them. SP8, you look for egoism. You look for very blunt nature, very straightforward, no fucks given, and focus on complete autonomy of their desires, complete freedom. And they are not gonna pay attention to, whoa, let me form friendships and let me like bond with people. They don't do that. Things have more utility for them. So there is more about use of things and rather than just based on like feeling of relational shit. Look for the selfishness that's more blatant and much more clear antisocial predisposition, because the SP8 is much more blatantly antisocial than the SO8, who is more social antisocial. So look for the egoism, cold-heartedness, insensitivity, and focus on them always carving their own path, while not really being more blinded to the world. Reading the Dramatics book, there's a pattern that comes clear in that book. And many people have told me that SLE SX8 is not gonna work. I've had many people tell me this, that they are very doubtful of that, and I'm like, come on, that doesn't make sense, right? That's not possible. But I actually thought, I read the book and I'm thinking, if this is how the type is like, this is not an SLE. This is not an SLE. So it's a type that basically is described as an individual who has no regard for any consequences, any limitations. So they just have no regard for any limitations any consequences, and they just go with the flow. They go with what excites them. They go with what makes them go crazy. They go with what makes them go emotional, right? Revs them up. They go with all of that. The type of a person that meets a girl one day and he feels something for her, so he spends $20,000 just like that, blink of an eye. And she rejects him, so he slaps the fucking shit out of her. And then he says, I'm so sorry, please love me. Mommy dumb bullshit, right? So that's very much SX8. So very expressive, dynamic, hyper, like impulsive people. But it's just true that with a knack for not really thinking things through and being anti-intellectual. That's true. Around what age do you think people become mature enough to start getting typed? I don't believe in typing young people. Brains getting rotten by this garbage. Like, that's why you're retarded, because you spend your time like reading into this identity shit. When you're 16, 17, you're not supposed to care about your identity. You're supposed to live life. So it's a big problem. If you want to be 20, bro, if you're 20, then we can talk about your type. If you're 20, we can talk. Thinking fears and desires is the way to type people. It's really not. So it's absolutely not the way. That's Risa Hudson level. Also, typing people by instincts separately, right? Oh, I'm a social instinct. No, you need to look at the subtype. It's true that the instinct does influence it, obviously, because it's an influence of it, but the way it manifests often varies. Woon Sevasi asks, what do you feel about 1F Enneagram 8? Impossible. I mean, I've been open to this possibility. I've talked to many people. Okay, is it possible? But no. It doesn't make sense, because if it's 1F, you need to put volitional placement, which is the most important, somewhere else. 2V or 3V. 3V is out of question for obvious reasons, and 2V doesn't work. Why the fuck would an 8 core have positive willpower towards other people? Flexible will. It doesn't make any sense, right? Narc, give us your opinion on the 3 best typology systems. I would say Enneagram. Enneagram, that's number 1. Mainly because of its utility, and also it's so complex, dude. It's so in-depth. You really know how a person works and operates and how you operate. You can understand yourself better that way. So that's something that I do like the most about it. It's just so complex. There's so much into it, so much there. Every subtype has so much to read about. I like it the most. And it's also really, if you are into like practical use, it's the best. You can grow from it. It can actually help you to grow from it. Second would probably be PY. Actually, I don't know. I find PY fun. It's simple, but yet it tells quite a bit about someone's personality and priorities. So I like it. And third would be like Socionics, because fuck MBTI. And that's it for today. I will be working on Psychosophy subtypes. And again, if you guys have any questions, ask down below. Let's go do it. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. Ciao.